Cheryl Popchuk. I'm a member of the Veterans Breakfast Club, and today I'm honored to interview one of our Vietnam veterans, Stuart Allen Steinberg, who spent about 5 years in the Army, a good chunk of that in Vietnam, as an Army EOD specialist. Pretty unusual, dangerous job, which Stu's going to tell us all about. But first, we want to get a little background on Stu. So welcome, Stu, and thank you for doing this interview with us.
Thanks.
As I indicated, you spent about 5 years in the Army. And from the research I've done and you shared with me, you experienced much more than your share of danger and adventure. But let's start with some of your family stories, some of your background.
Sure.
So tell us a little bit about where you were born and what your family was like, family life was like growing up.
Well, I was born in Washington, D.C. And when I was, I don't know, 3 or 4, moved across the river into what was then just a village called Falls Church, which is now just another huge suburb of DC.
I have relatives who live there now.
And what's interesting is Falls Church, it turns out, has become a huge location of a lot of Vietnamese people.
Interesting.
And when we moved into Falls Church, it was so small that my parents' hardware store was also the post office.
Oh my.
Yeah. And so I grew up in suburban Virginia and graduated from high school in Fairfax County. And after I graduated, I went to college in New Mexico and almost immediately flunked out. And by the time I got back home in May or June of 1968, I already had the draft board was I'm trying to think how to say this.
They were on your tail.
Yeah, the draft board was after me. And I knew I didn't want to get drafted because in 1966, they were drafting people into the Marines. I mean, basically, they would line everybody up, have you count off by 4, and every 4th person was in the Marines. So in order to avoid that, I enlisted.
So it wasn't your aspiration to have a military career. Did you have another aspiration even when you were in college?
I think so. Yeah, no, I don't think so. I don't think I did.
Was there any other members of your family who had served in the military?
Yeah, my dad served in World War II. He had almost graduated from Virginia Tech, where he was an ROTC cadet. And so he spent 5 years in the Army as an infantry officer, and was the company commander of an infantry unit. And then when the war ended, he spent 2 years on MacArthur's staff.
Oh, wow.
And yeah, and was involved in, helping rebuild Japan, after the atomic bombs. And I know now that my dad had post-traumatic stress disorder, and he would never, ever talk about some of the events that he was involved in. After he passed away, I made a FOIA request to the National Archives and ended up with just a ton of documents about my dad's units. And the battles that he was involved in: Borneo, New Guinea, the Philippines, and was actually on board a ship on his way to Japan when they dropped the bombs.
Wow.
So, yeah.
Do you think your father was happy, apprehensive about your joining the Army?
My dad was really supportive of it. That's really a funny story. The night before I enlisted, a buddy of mine who I ended up going in with, at that time, the drinking age in DC was 18. So we went into DC on, excuse me, the evening of July the 27th and just got hammered. I mean, really hammered. And we woke up the next morning in my car on a fairway of the Army Navy Golf and Country Club. And,
Pretty hammered.
I got out of the car and I could see where we had driven through the fence. And what ended up happening was we could look way down the fairway and see a vehicle coming. So we decided, well, we better get the hell out of here. And we ended up in downtown Alexandria. And we ended up going down there because there was a Waffle House. And Waffle House, first of all, had the best waffles and the best shoestring potatoes everywhere, anywhere. So we're sitting there eating and looking out the window, and across the street were all of the recruiters: Marines, Army, Air Force, Navy. So we actually ended up deciding, well, let's go join the Marines. And thank God they weren't there. They were off. They were off doing something at a school or some crap. And so we went next door to the Army and enlisted. And yeah, I went out to the country club where my parents were members. They had been in a golf tournament, and I caught up with them in the bar, basically, and told them I had just enlisted and I needed to be taken to the train station that night at midnight. Wow. And my dad was completely understanding, and I think proud of me to some extent. My mom freaked the hell out, and I, at that time, July 27th, 1966, I couldn't have shown you on a map where Vietnam was, let alone was aware of that there was actually a war going on. But anyway, and it's kind of a funny story. My buddy and I got down, took the train from Richmond, and we ended up at Fort Jackson, South Carolina. So they had everybody lined up, and then they called out me and my buddy, and ended up telling Murphy that he had a medical condition that made him ineligible to be in the military. And what that was a pilonidal cyst, which is typically caused by an ingrown hair at the base of the spine. And what they said to him was, you got two choices. One, we'll send you right over to the hospital. They'll remove this thing and you'll be good to go in a day. Or you don't have to do that and you can get out. Well, damn it if he didn't say, oh, screw it, I'm getting out. So there I was by myself at Fort Jackson. And they said to me, well, you can't stay here because we're full. There was not a basic training company that had an opening. So they had me get in this Jeep with some private or something, and we went across the border into Georgia Fort Gordon. And that's where I ended up taking basic training. And what was funny was I was an RA, regular Army. That means I had enlisted in the regular Army. And I ended up in a company of all enlisted reservists from Wisconsin. And they had joined the reserves thinking, oh, this will keep me out of Vietnam. Well, boy, they were wrong about that. Anyway.
I'll bet you had some interesting conversations with them.
Yeah, actually, one of them, who had been a high-ranking Union guy named Bill Sable, he and I became really good friends in basic. And because I was the only regular Army guy in this company, the company leaders basically made me what you would call the acting jack. In other words, I had this armband with sergeant stripes on it. And I was like, I'm trying to think of how to describe this. Well, I just ended up, I ended up getting out of a lot of stuff that everyone else ended up having to do. I never had KP. And what happened was the second week of basic, they sent me to driver's school. So I learned how to drive the big trucks, the deuce and a halves and the 5 tons. So when my company had, like, for instance, had to go to the range at night and do these night things, firing their weapons and, whatever else, I didn't have to do that. I drove the truck, took people out, then I came back, picked up hot food, went back out, got everyone fed, went back to the unit. Anyway, and then a couple other things that happened was we had guard mount where everyone, was in their freshly starched and fatigues, and you had your weapon, and then the brigade commander, this colonel, came around and checked everyone out. And in the end, between my dress, the cleanliness of my weapon, and my answers to the questions that he asked me, I ended up being picked as captain of the guard mount, I guess. I don't know. And I got a $25 savings bond. And then the next day, I drove the colonel around in his Jeep.
So it sounds like you showed some early promise, in the Army.
Well, I dug it.
Let's move on to some of the more action-packed scenes from your experience in the military.
Sure.
On to the danger and adventure, as we say. You became an Army EOD specialist, explosive ordnance disposal specialist. Now, we're going to talk a lot about that for the rest of this interview. And I'm going to give first a little bit of background on what that position is and how it came to be in the Army. The birth of the modern bomb disposal, I found, dates back to the Battle of Britain in 1940.
Yeah.
The British troops were the ones who developed some techniques for handling unexploded bombs, what they called UXBs. Now, some of our older members might recall a 1979, 1980-ish masterpiece theater series from the BBC called Danger UXB. And Stu, you
actually,
to me that it was very
I actually have that series on VHS.
Mm-hmm.
And funny, I was just talking to this buddy of mine last night, a friend of mine who's a retired Green Beret, wanted to know if I had a VHS player because he had something he wanted to watch. And I said, well, no, I don't. Because, I also have, the BBC show. And I've never been able to watch it.
It was pretty accurate. I watched it religiously. I was enthralled. by it. And on a trip to England myself in the early 1980s, a plan had to be diverted because they found an unexploded bomb in the 1980s in the basement of one of the buildings, and an area was being cordoned off.
And this happens all the time.
Yeah. Now,
in fact, they just uncovered. They were doing construction of a new housing development in Poland, and uncovered a World War II, a 2,000 pounder.
Oh wow!
From World War II. Yeah.
So the Brits got it started, and then the U.S. was planning its own bomb disposal process, but they were going to keep it a civilian function until January of '42. I found out when the Army Ordnance Department formed a bomb disposal organization and a school, and took the civilian agencies right out of the picture.
Yeah, that was at Aberdeen.
Yeah. The training focused on bomb recognition, how to use bomb disposal equipment, bomb excavation, and rigging.
My friend Bob Leyendecker is a retired EOD lieutenant colonel, and then spent, I don't know, 20, 25, 30 years as an analyst for the CIA. So he wrote this, Bomb Disposal, the Early Years of Explosive Ordnance Disposal, 1940 to 1949.
Wow. That's quite a volume.
It's big. Yeah.
Well, you have to look up in the index and see if you can find this citation, Stu, because I cracked up over this one. One of the early training manuals that the American school borrowed from the Brits had this title, Objects Dropped from the Air. That's an interesting, quaint way of referencing a bomb, I think.
Yeah.
I don't know if you ever had training from that manual, but by May of 1942, so just 4 or 5 months later, the 231st Bomb Disposal Company became the first such unit in Army history. And then from that point, the Army Training Center at Aberdeen that you referenced became the training center for all bomb disposal units, no matter which branch of the service. And they also trained civil defense groups as well. I found that the first recovered unexploded bomb was actually found in 1942 along the Elk River in Maryland. I didn't get the story behind it, but that sounds like one worth exploring. By the spring of 1944, even though the Brits had about a 5-year head start on the American squads in unexploded ordnance, American bomb disposal procedures and equipment were proving to be better and were being very eagerly adopted. One example, the British equipment that was in use weighed about 2 tons, while the US equipment weighed about 200 pounds. So clear advantage to the US there. Post-World War II, the EOD units continued to develop in all the branches, and it's the one job, I'm going to share my screen here for a second. It's the one job now, what I found is the badge of those who are in the explosive ordnance disposal units. And it's the one unit that it's the one job in all 4 branches that has this one badge. And you said, Stu, yours was the basic EOD one, this one right here.
Yeah.
You wore that on your uniform.
Yep. I should have actually been made a supervisor. That's the badge with the star and the bomb. And the unit I was in at the time, which was the 67th Ordnance Detachment in Ravenna, Ohio, they just never put me in for it.
You're now in the EOD unit. You told us a little bit about your basic training. Maybe you want to tell us about how you got into the EOD unit. I don't know if that's something you volunteer for or you have to be handpicked for.
No, you volunteer for it. What happened was after basic, I had decided that I wanted to be airborne, and I was hoping to be able to qualify for special forces. And when I was in the first week of advanced infantry training, they came into the classroom one day and called out me and a guy who became one of my best friends in the Army, Tom Brown. They called us out and they said, we've been going through records, and you two are eligible for explosive ordnance disposal if you'd want to do that. And I said, well, what's that? He said, it's the bomb squad. And I said, why the hell would I want to do that? And they said, well, for one thing, you get an extra $55 a month for hazardous duty pay, and you'll get to wear this cool badge. And I said, oh, okay, well, sign me up. and that's how I ended up in EOD.
I guess this is probably not the best time to ask you, but we're eventually going to get to the question, did you ever regret that decision?
Never.
So what was your training like for this particular assignment?
At that time, school ran in basically three sections. The first one was at Fort McClellan, Alabama. Yeah. And that was for 3 weeks of chemical and biological weapons. So one of the interesting things we saw were these soldiers who had been surreptitiously given LSD, and they were flipping out. And one guy was like up in a tree, going nuts. It was. And after that, then you went to the main school, which at that time was at Indian Head, Maryland, which was basically where the Potomac River went into the Chesapeake Bay. And that lasted from like late July through the following January. So I graduated in January of 1968. Okay. And the third phase was what they called rigging and digging, where we went to Eglin Air Force Base in Florida, and we learned how to dig down to a bomb buried in about, I don't know, 7 or maybe 8 feet of sand. What we had to do is we had to put shaft down to where the bomb was, and we would have to pull it out using ropes and pulleys. And anyway, so I graduated on January the 7th, 1968, and Tom Brown and I were both sent to this place called Dugway Proving Grounds in Utah. And I don't know if you'll remember this or not, but on March the 13th, 1968, an F-4 Phantom jet took off from Dugway, made a turn, and was supposed to drop a ton of nerve gas inside the perimeter of Dugway Proving Grounds. What happened was the round malfunctioned. So a ton of nerve gas ended up being dropped on a sheep ranch, and it killed everything. I mean, it didn't just kill the sheep. It killed the herders' horses, their herd dogs. And the only reason no people were killed was for some weird reason. It was a Thursday, and all of the herders were not there. They were actually in the town of Tooele drinking at some bar, something like that. And so, yeah, when we got done cleaning that up, myself, Tom Brown, and another one of my good friends, Danny Lewards, the next day, after getting hammered the night before at the enlisted men's club, we all went down to personnel and volunteered for Vietnam.
Okay. So your first mission was a pretty important one, and maybe a pretty dangerous one too. Do you think your training overall, in addition to helping out with that disaster, prepared you well for what you were going to be facing in Vietnam as you look back on it now?
Well, yeah, to some extent, because one of the things about Dugway was it was a research and development site. So we worked on a lot of weapon systems that were new. One example was the XM, say 64. It was a round mine, a white phosphorus mine that when it was stepped on, it blew the charge of white phosphorus up into the air when it then detonated and sprayed white phosphorus over a pretty extensive area. And white phosphorus, if you're not familiar with it, if you get it on your skin, will literally burn a hole right through you. And the only way to deal with it was with water. And if you didn't have access to water, you were going to get the hell burned out of you. And then one of the other things that we worked on there was what was called a railgun. And this was a weapon system that fired a laser beam at an immobile object. I think it might have been a train car or something like that. Excuse me. But yeah, and the duty overall there just sucked.
Well, let's get you over to
yeah,
Vietnam. I'm going to try sharing the screen again and see if
sure.
we can get to, first of all, here's a picture of you. I'm sorry about the panel on the left. It probably is just going to be easiest to leave that up and not fuss with it too much. This
Sure.
is a picture of you with the very haunting caption, "The 1,000-meter stare." So this is you during your duty in Vietnam. This is early in your stay in Vietnam, is it not, Stu?
This was right near the end.
Oh, right near the end. Okay.
Yeah, this was February 11th, 1970.
Okay.
And I left Vietnam on March the 24th.
Okay. This picture will come back to us when we talk about your book, but for now, I wanted to focus on your time in Vietnam. I've highlighted some of the bases where you spent some time.
Yeah.
And you also spent some time in Cu Chi.
Yeah, I was on temporary duty. Yeah.
Okay. So this might sound like a weird thing, but here you are in Vietnam and you're going to be doing this job as an EOD specialist. Did you enjoy it? Maybe that's not the right way to phrase that, but
I loved it.
you loved it. That sounds like maybe it was a calling for you. It may have actually been a calling.
Well, at that time, an EOD team was 9 men, and then we had a clerk, so it was a 10-man team. And you became really close with the men that you served with. Yeah, I wouldn't trade it for anything.
On any of these assignments, Quy Nhon, An Khê, Phu Bai, Cu Chi, could you describe for us a typical day? Not necessarily your most harrowing day, unless all the days were harrowing, but what would a typical day be like, Stu?
Well, kind of, that's really hard to define. I mean, a typical day, first of all, when I was in Quy Nhon with the 184th, we ran 2-man on-site teams with 2 battalions of the 173rd Airborne Brigade. And one of those teams was at a place called LZ English. And it was about 60 miles north of Quinyon, right off of Highway 1. And we ran a second two-man team. You see where it says Tuiwa? Just
Right.
below Quinyon?
Yes.
Yeah, we ran a two-man team out of Tuiwa as well. And what basically what we did was we supported infantry units from the 173rd Airborne Brigade, Special Forces, Navy SEALs, and so we were on a lot of combat operations with units from the 173rd Airborne Brigade.
So it sounds like there was no real typical day for you when in this.
It just depended. And just to give you a kind of a more extreme example, when the Quinyon ammo dump went up the third time, March 23rd, 1969.
We're actually going to talk about
Yeah,
your experiences at Queen on. Should we jump into that now, Stu?
sure.
This picture maybe will also help you share with the audience your tools of the trade or what you were dealing with. Do you want to explain? You're here on the left and your buddy on the right. You want to tell us what's going on in this picture?
Well, this was taken at a place called Fire Support Base Rifle, which was a forward operating base of the 101st Airborne Division. And Rifle had been overrun. So Paul and I went in. And it's actually where the title of my book came from, because we were circling the LZ and you could see the carnage. It was bad. There were bodies everywhere. There were rounds cooking off from when a mortar round had hit the ammo dump.
Mm-hmm.
And as we were, getting ready to come in, I turned to Paul and said, "Man, this is what hell looks like." And that's where the title of the book came from.
Okay.
So all of everything that you see here are things that we disarmed or took care of. This is all enemy ordnance, 1 pound blocks of TNT and a lot of rocket propelled grenades. And these are extremely dangerous items.
With these things.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Very dangerous. And if you couldn't tell that they had been fired, you have to assume that they had been fired and that they were armed.
Okay.
So, disarming these things was quite the deal.
Yeah, it sounds like that alone was pretty tricky business.
Yeah.
So we're gonna go to Quinyon, where you tell the story about what happened on a day when you were almost killed, May 13th, 1969, while you were stationed there. We have a couple of pictures that were in your book that I want to share. You want to describe what this picture is about, Stu?
Well, we were about 5 miles up the road from the Quinyon ammo dump. And we were, just kind of sitting around in the unit, drinking beer, whatever. And all of a sudden, things started shaking. We thought it was an earthquake. And we ran outside, and that's what we saw from 5 miles away. And we were called out probably no more than a minute or two later. So here we are in our 3/4 ton with MP gun jeeps, military police gun jeeps in front of us and behind us. So here we are hauling ass, down the road, going towards the ammo dump. We got shrapnel all over the place. It was a miracle that we got to the dump, without being blown off the road.
Is this what you found when you got there?
After the fires died down.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's a pad of 105 millimeter high explosive rounds. They were just all over the place.
And so that fire, I guess, pretty much lasted through the night.
Well, there were three separate attacks: February 23rd, March 10, 11, and March 23rd.
Okay.
And it was like every time we started getting things cleaned up, they'd blow up the dump again. And the thing is, they never saw anyone. In other words, they never saw the Viet Cong sappers who got into the dump and set their satchel charges and got out without ever being seen, even though there were dozens of gun towers, bunkers with armed guys in it, and then outside the dump you had like Korean Marines had set up ambush sites. The long range recon teams had set up ambush sites, and they never saw anyone.
So how long would it take? You said there were these three separate attacks by the Viet Cong. How long would it take a team like yours to clean up after one of those attacks?
Well, the day I was wounded, March 13th, 1969, or May the 13th,
Yeah.
we were pretty much almost done.
Okay.
And then we happened to, as we were going back through the pads to make sure we'd gotten everything, my buddy Roger McCormick and I had driven into this pad of 8-inch rounds, which are really, really big, big bullets. I mean, they're like huge.
Is that what's pictured here?
Oh, this is a 105.
Okay.
And how this happened is beyond believability almost, that this round, which when it went through these two propellant canisters, didn't set them off. It was just a miracle.
So you said you were almost finished with the cleanup.
Yeah. So Roger and I are in this pad, and we just happened to look up, and we saw this mortar round sticking out from between two of these 8-inch bullets. And you couldn't tell if the round was armed or not, but you had to assume it was. The 81 millimeter mortar round at that time had a nose plunger, and there was a ring that went around the fuse, and where it went into the fuse, it blocked the firing pin from being able to hit the detonator. So we tied communications wire to the tail fins, rolled it out, I don't know, 300-400 feet, got down behind the truck and gave it a good jerk. And we could actually hear the round hit the concrete pad, bounce around a few times. So Roger and I are going, well, let's give it about 10 minutes, see if it's going to detonate. Well, it didn't. So we went back into the pad, and you could see that the bore riding pin was gone. The plunger was mashed down into the fuse. So, we were pretty certain that the firing pin was in the detonator. And we knew there was a chance that if we moved it, it would detonate and kill us. But that's what they paid us the extra money for each month. And so I laid sandbags down the bed of the truck, picked up the round, put it on the sandbags, and then covered it with another layer of sandbags. And what I did was, the spare tire for the 3/4 ton was really pretty big. And behind the driver's seat were these wooden slats. So I picked up the spare tire and propped it up against the wooden slats. That's what saved my life, because I backed out of the pad. I got about 50 feet, and I heard this bang. And this is all happening in the space of 2 or 3 seconds. And I thought to myself, bang. And I turned around to look, and the round had gone off right over the gas tank. So now I've got this fireball coming at me. And right about the time that I thought, oh, I need to unass this vehicle, the explosion, excuse me, had blown the doors off. And right as I was thinking, I got to get out of the truck, the blast hit me, blew me out of the door. And I ended up kind of rolling down this embankment. And as I kind of, yeah, that's what the bed of the truck looked like after the round detonated. This 5-gallon gas can, why that didn't detonate, that's another one of those things that just, you know, was kind of beyond belief. And
so you were sitting in front of this.
Yeah.
These are, I guess, maybe the wooden what's left of the wooden slats that saved your life.
Yeah. And there you can see where the hole went off, or where the round went off, right over the gas tank. Mm-hmm. That spare tire saved my life.
Saved your life, but you weren't uninjured.
Oh.
What happened next?
Well, when I was on the ground, I kind of raised up on an elbow, and I could see the truck continuing to go very slowly down the road, and it was on fire. And I thought to myself, oh my God, the truck goes into one of these pads we've already cleaned. It's going to start a fire, and we'll be in big trouble again. And what happened was, right at the last minute, the truck veered off the road to the left, and they didn't have regular fire trucks back then. They had pumpers. So there was this pond where the pumpers would go and, suck in water. And as I watched, the truck veered off the road over the embankment into the pond, put the fire out. So now I'm laying there, and, I didn't know at the time, but the blast had blown holes through both of my eardrums. And it was kind of like the wind was going through my head. I could sort of hear this buzzing sound. And of course, I ended up with constant tinnitus. It's happening right now. Mine is kind of like a high-pitched radio wave. I refer to it as radio waves from aliens, and I don't mean Mexicans. I'm talking about aliens from outer space. And so I'm laying there on my back, and one of my teammates, Mike Lezak, who eventually lost a leg because he did something stupid and didn't listen to me. He asked me, was I okay? And I said, do I look like I'm effing okay? And then I lost consciousness. And I don't remember being medevaced. I woke up at the battalion, the 51st Medical Battalion's aid station. And they, kind of, got me stabilized and whatnot. And 4 days later, I was back to work.
4 days later?
Yeah.
Wow. I guess they really needed you out there dealing with the unexploded ordnance.
It was the job.
Did you go back with any trepidation, thinking, well, I dodged a bullet this time?
No.
I think that's testimony to you did enjoy this work to some extent. You had your calling.
Yeah.
It didn't take long for you to get in the thick of it again. And I'm sure between May 13th, 1969 and January 24th, 1970, which we're going to talk about now, other things happened to you. But we could spend hours talking about your service in Vietnam, Stu, as you well know. So we're gonna go for highlights, and certainly one of the highlights is when you earned the Bronze Star with the V device at Phu Bai. That V device denoting that the medal is for heroism or valor in combat. I have one more slide to share here, and let's see if I can come up with it quickly. This is a map of the base at Phu Bai, I presume. And why don't you tell us what happened that earned you the Bronze Star on January 24th, 1970?
Well, my teammate and I, Jim Qualls, uh, uh, went into Fire Support Base Davis, um, and where they were uh, setting up what's called an artillery raid, where they fly in a battery of howitzers, in this case, 105s, and they set up really quickly, and then they just start firing up the area, uh, artillery rounds. So the first thing that happened was Jim and I landed. Uh, uh, we're here on the left, and our job at that point was to clear this LZ of potential booby traps. And we landed with the Pathfinders, and the Pathfinders are who set up the LZ. So we told the Pathfinders to hang out and let us clear the LZ. So Jim and I start walking across this area, and we were probably maybe 50 yards apart, and I got to a point where the ground right in front of me looked weird. It looked like it had been freshly turned. So I dropped my bag, which was full of explosives, EOD stuff, shape charges and time fuse and TNT blocks and whatever. And I got down on a knee and I started flipping the dirt over this place that looked like it had been freshly dug. And I get down a few inches and I see a black commo wire, which is where it says pull wire WO-1. And I could see that this wire was being pulled. It was being pulled away from me. And I looked up and I saw an NVA soldier in a tree. He had the wire in his hands and he was pulling on it. And I grabbed my side cutters, grabbed the wire, pulled it towards me, and cut it. And then threw a red smoke grenade. Gunships came in, fired up the trees, killed that guy and his buddy that was on the ground, and eventually discovered I was standing on top of a booby-trapped 155 millimeter high explosive projectile that had 5 Czechoslovakian pull friction fuses jammed into the fuse well. So this guy was pulling on these fuses when I cut the wire. Oh,
And
well, just one of the other things. When we landed, we immediately noticed NVA mine marker, which showed there was 5 rocks on an ammo can lid and suspected booby trap markers. And there were 4, one each on the north, the east, south, and the west sides. So we knew there were, going to be booby traps. And then there was one in the middle. So we knew that this device that I ended up disarming, we knew that was likely going to be there, based on the booby trap marker.
So this item that you had to deactivate was planted by the Viet Cong?
North Vietnamese.
North Vietnamese. Okay. Obviously, a very heroic act, but maybe by this time in your career, a typical day.
Well, yeah. I mean, yeah, you could have something like this happen anytime you went out. It just kind of all depended on where you were going. A lot of times we got called in by long range recon people, uh, special forces, Navy SEALs. Whenever there was an airstrike, and it could be anywhere from 250-pound bombs up to 2,000-pound bombs, which were typically dropped by the Navy, there were going to be duds. So say for instance, long range recon people would put in a call, and we would fly in, hump to the device, set charges, all the time fuse lighters, and haul ass to get away from the detonation. So yeah, any day it could be something like that. Yeah, let's get back to the Quinyon ammo dump. There was a 3-day period where everyone in the team, besides me and my good friend Doug Rhodes, was in the dump working. Doug and I were the EOD team for the entirety of Bindin province, which is the province Quinyon was in. So for 3 days, Doug and I were the EOD team for this huge area of operations, and no sleep.
Get called to go anywhere in the province?
Yep.
Wow. Quite a heavy weight on your shoulders. That event at Fubai happened in January of 1970, and your active service in Vietnam ended in May of 1970. And
March.
at that May or March, you were transferred at that point to the inactive reserves. So let's talk about that transition.
Well, no. When I came back from Vietnam, the first place they sent me is this place in New Jersey called Picatinny Arsenal.
Mhm.
It was another research and development site. And when I got there, I found out that this guy who had actually been one of my instructors at school, and then ended up in the 184th in Quinyon, he was there after losing part of a leg because he didn't listen to me and stepped on an anti-personnel mine.
Mhm.
And I knew I couldn't be there with this guy.
Mhm.
So I got a 3-day pass. I put on my dress uniform with all my whatever medals and ribbons, whatever. I went down to the Pentagon and I said, "Oh, you got to get me out of this place." And so he asked me, "Well, where would you want to go?" And I said, "Well, anywhere but Picatinny Arsenal." So I ended up on this team in Ohio, in a place called Ravenna, which was a not abandoned, but it was an old ammo dump.
Mhm.
And what they stored there were, I mean, bunkers, dozens and dozens of bunkers
Wow.
that were full of propellant. And at that time, the propellant was basically black powder. Black powder can detonate spontaneously from static electricity, from breathing on it too hard. It's really, really very bad stuff. Yeah.
So you continued to in your line of dangerous work.
Well, one of the first things that happened was after I got to that unit, is they sent me back to school for nuclear weapons.
Oh, wow.
So I ended up being nuclear weapons qualified. The highest security clearance that there was at the time, particularly if you were nuclear weapons qualified, was called a Critical Nuclear Weapons Design Information Clearance, CNWDI. And that's the clearance that we had to deal with nuclear weapons if it became a necessity.
Well, you're now stateside, but you're still in the service.
Yeah.
When you leave the service, do you remember what your transition was like at that point?
Well, they were asking me to re-enlist again I had already reenlisted once, and they offered me another stripe. I would have been a staff sergeant and a lot of money. Well, the problem was by early 1971, they were starting to drug test people. And I was smoking pot. So I knew then it was time to get out. And because if I'd gotten drug tested, well, obviously I would have been court-martialed for one thing. And yeah, so I said, screw this, I'm out of here.
Time to leave.
And I remember as I was leaving Ravenna Arsenal and I'm going down this road in Ohio, and I had all of my dress uniforms on the seat beside me. And I was driving a brand new Triumph Spitfire, and I had the top down, and I tossed all my uniforms out of the car.
That sounds very freeing to someone like me.
Yeah, it was.
So you're an interesting dichotomy, Stu. Very proud of your military service, but you knew when you had your fill.
Yeah.
And it was time to quit.
Time to go.
Do you remember your homecoming at your actual home, how your family received you and friends, and what it was like in that transition?
Well, well, when I first got out, I lived with my folks out in Fairfax, Virginia. And one of my cousins, who I still communicate with through Messenger and Facebook, he and I and another friend of ours who had been a Navy SEAL, Jimmy McQuarrie, and the three of us found a house that we rented. And we all lived together for, I don't know, maybe a year. And I was going to the local community college and, trying to figure out what I was going to do. I was going to school during the day and driving a cab at night. Well, it was a lot of
you had to work through a lot of pain, didn't you?
Yeah.
You weren't unlike so many of our Vietnam vets dealing with post-traumatic stress and all that sort of thing, to complicate life once you tried to transition back to the civilian state. At what point, there's a big gap between your military service and the point at which you decide to write this book. This is what hell looks like. I don't know if people are seeing it correctly on my screen because we might be posting backwards or something. But why did you ultimately write your book in about 2017, 2018, I guess is when you wrote it?
Well, I had actually been working on it in one form or another for a bunch of years. And my good friend, Greg Walker, who's a retired Green Beret, was reading a draft. And at that time, I was calling the book Vietnam, just Vietnam. So Greg's got the draft and he calls me up and he says, dude, title of your book is what you said to your friend Paul when you guys were flying into Rifle, when you said, this is what hell looks like. That's the title of your book. And that's how it ended up being the title of the book.
Did you find writing the book over the time that you spent on it therapeutic? It helped you sort things out, process things?
Yeah, it was very cathartic. Especially the first chapter, which is about fire-based rifle. I was, because of the work I do for other vets, I'm a service officer with Vietnam Veterans of America. So I help other vets get their VA benefits. And
Well, let me interject here one little fact that might help this part of the story along, Stu. Um, Ultimately, you did become a lawyer.
yeah,
And you had a 23-year career, a quite noble career as a public defender. And during that time, you also developed your service work, your volunteer work with other veterans. So maybe if you want to talk about both your time as a public defender and your volunteer work, those two stories might mesh nicely here.
well, my public defender status was I was being appointed on heavy felony criminal cases, and was really good at what I did. A lot of my defendants were found not guilty, and one day in it had been 1989, I guess. I don't know. I woke up one morning and I thought, oh, I can't do this anymore. And I quit. I basically told the bar I was freaking out. My PTSD was pretty bad.
Mhm.
And I quit. And got in my car with as much crap as I could cram in it, and my cat.
Mhm.
And I think I had an 8-track player. So I had a bunch of 8-track tapes, hard rock, heavy metal,
Mhm.
and headed west.
And that was the end of your career as a public defender.
Yeah.
Okay.
Uh,
But you've continued to do work with veterans. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Well, yeah. I was a service officer, still am, with Vietnam Veterans of America. So I losing my train of thought here.
What type of work do you do as a service officer, Stu?
Well, I help other vets get their benefits from the VA.
Okay.
I file claims for disability compensation or pension
Mhm.
if they're non-service connected issues.
And I'm sure that's an invaluable service to vets because that whole bureaucracy can be so overwhelming and confusing. So someone who
Yeah,
knows how to cut through it would really be a savior.
yeah.
So you're still performing heroics, even if it's not on a battlefield with your comrades. Um, I'd like to wrap up with some big picture questions for you.
Sure.
This has been a pretty heavy story about some stark realities of war. But I wondered if, amidst all the dangers that you faced in the military, can you remember something really funny that happened to you during your tour of duty, to you or your unit or a friend? Anything to
Really?
lighten your load as an EOD specialist.
Well, one of the things about EOD teams in Vietnam was uh, we all had a bar, and our bar was by far, no rhyme intended, uh, one of the nicest bars in Fubai. And so we used to spend a lot of time in the bar, and we lived with uh, Marines, Third Force Recon. So they were in our bar a lot too. And one night there was two young Marines. One, I'll never forget this guy. His name was Roger Corr, Corr.
Mhm.
And he and this buddy of his, they were drinking in our bar. We're supposed to go on R&R the next day. They got really hammered. And eventually got into a fight, and Core in this fight bites off his buddy's ear in the bar, and he eventually, of course, got locked up, court-martialed, and spent, I don't know, 3-4 months in the brig. And so he gets out, and he's back in our bar, and our clerk, Donnie Urquhart, who was this huge guy, he'd been a linebacker at the University of Wisconsin. I mean, he was big. And Core gets in his face, and Donnie says, "Oh no, you effing blah, blah, blah. You're not biting my ear off," and then knocked the hell out. So, yeah, it was pretty funny.
Some interesting bar scenes there in Vietnam.
Yeah.
Did your time in Vietnam affect your views on war in general, or any of the post-Vietnam era wars that we've been engaged in since?
Wait a minute, say that, ask me that again.
If your service in Vietnam affected your views on war in general, or any of the particular wars that America has fought in since Vietnam?
Well, in 2009, at the age of 62, I went to Afghanistan, and I was an advisor to a battalion of the Afghan Border Police. And it was quite an interesting experience. What we did was we taught courses to the battalion's NCO cadets and their command staff, the officers. And I taught courses in improvised explosive devices, ordnance identification, searches of people, places, and things. And what we did is we helped develop intelligence about smuggling operations. Mm-hmm. And then we would go on these counter-narcotics
raids or something.
Yeah. And this was mostly along the Iranian border. Okay. So yeah, it was quite the experience.
So you have actually maintained an interest in actively helping the military post-Vietnam.
Yeah.
Is there one lesson that you've learned from all your military service that you've never forgotten? It just really has stood out to you.
Yeah, that would have to be the closeness of the men we served with. Like I said, at that time, it was a 9-man team. Today, they have EOD companies, which are 44 people. And then there are 4 companies in an EOD battalion and 4 battalions in an EOD group. And I've actually had one of the guys in today's EOD ask me, well, what was it like back then? And I would tell them, well, there was 2 guys in a Jeep with your personal weapons and all your EOD gear. Now, it's like the 44-man companies have their own infantry squad that goes with them on calls. We didn't have any of that. Like I said, there's 2 guys in a Jeep and your personal weapons. And you could be literally driving through enemy-held territory and just hoping you didn't get hit, ambushed, whatever. Yeah.
So there's a special camaraderie among the men and women who serve in these units. Yeah, I think
absolutely.
That's pretty easy to understand. Would you recommend young people today join the military?
Yes. And right now, the Army in particular is having a hard time recruiting the numbers that they need in order to keep military strength up to date. And I think that the best solution to this is more money.
Mhm.
They need to be paying these kids today 2 or 3 times what they're getting paid now,
Mhm.
uh, and uh, uh, and bonuses,
Mhm.
for enlisting for things like EOD.
Right. Right.
I think the current bonus now is, I want to say, 100 grand. It's way up there,
Wow.
and yeah,
It sounds to me like you would do it all over again if you could.
yep.
That
I'll
you
tell
don't.
you, and I'll tell you the truth. Like I said, I went to Afghanistan when I was 62. If I were, I'm 75 now. If I were 10 years younger, I'd be in Ukraine.
Really.
Yep.
I
Yeah.
think.
In fact, I met uh, at our EOD convention this year in St. Louis. Uh, we met these folks from Bomb Techs Without Borders.
Mhm.
And these are former American EOD personnel who are in Ukraine training their bomb disposal people.
Oh my.
And how I found out about them was I found this video of this Ukraine uh, bomb squad who had a bomb dog, this little Jack Russell Terrier named Patron. And he was wearing this neat little jacket, whatever.
Mhm.
So when I met the Culps, I asked them, you know, uh, how's this dog doing? And they said, well, so far he's discovered like 200 IEDs or dud ordnance, or whatever. So I decided that Patron needed an EOD badge. So I still had my EOD badge from my dress uniform. I put it in a little box and I sent it over there. So now Patron has my EOD badge on his jacket.
Oh my gosh, Stu, that is a wonderful story. But
Yeah.
having spoken to you for the past hour or so, I'm not convinced you're not going to show up in Ukraine someday. I just have
No,
a feeling I might see you
yeah,
on the news some night.
too old.
Too old, huh? Well, we're going to wind this up with a very moving closing from your book. You ended your book with a poem, and I'm going to give you a second to pull it up
I got
and
it.
tell us a little bit. There's a very poignant remark about when this was written and how it relates to you. And if you wouldn't mind sharing that and then sharing the poem, we'll all be listening.
Yeah. Well, uh, Major O'Donnell wrote this on January 1st, 1970 at Dak To. Dak To in 1967 was the location of what they call the Hill Battles. And it was units from the 173rd Airborne Brigade uh, fighting against a huge uh, enemy force. And and the 173rd lost, I don't know, 285 men at the Battle of Dak To. Major O'Donnell died in a helicopter crash in Cambodia. And it says March 1970. It was actually March 24th. He died on the same day I left Vietnam after 18 months. And the poem is, if you are able, save them a place inside you and save one backward glance when you are leaving for the places they can no longer go. Trying to not crack up here.
You take your time.
Be not ashamed to say you love them, though you may or may not have always. Take what they have left and what they have taught you with their dying and keep it as your own. And in that time, that when men decide and feel safe to call the war insane, take one moment to embrace these gentle heroes you left behind.
Lovely, lovely, lovely. And Stu, it's an understatement to say thank you for your service, because your service wasn't just in Vietnam. It continued and continues today with the work you've done and do for vets. So thank you for all of that. And thank you for spending time to tell your story to the Veterans Breakfast Club History Project. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, it's a really cool program.
We're glad to have you be a part of it. And this is
Thanks.
for the archives now, so you're part of our history too.
Cool.
Thanks so much, Stu.
All right. Thanks, Carol.
Be well, my friend.
You too.
Bye-bye.